Hey everyone, Sean Andrew Murray here. So, the assignment given to me by Imagined Effects was to create a moody environment piece in a city setting. So, first thing I did was I went to my sketchbook sketches to find some inspiration, um, looking for ideas there since it's a pretty open-ended assignment. And initially, as you can see, I was going to actually start by pulling out some sketches and sort of collaging a couple of things together. Uh, but as you'll see, I kind of think the better of this idea, and I decide instead to just start from scratch with a new idea based on some inspired by some of these sketches. So what I do is I switch to a brush that is essentially like a squished circle. It's sort of a flat brush. And if you have the pen tilt on, then what you can do with a brush like this is you can create thin, straight lines, and then you can create thicker, fatter lines, depending on how you tilt your stylus. I've been using this brush a lot lately because this way I don't have to switch around to different tools in order to create thinner and thicker lines and to fill in areas when I'm doing a really rough sketch. So I find it's a great tool for rough sketching, especially something that's sort of environment focused. So, or that has like a lot of architecture. So it works pretty well for me. So what I'm doing here is I'm blocking in shapes. I've got some very light, rough perspective lines in there, a horizon line, and then I start just creating interesting angles and interesting shapes and trying to create a good balance between negative and positive shapes. Bridges are a great way to create negative space and to add a dynamic element to your city environments. Um, the horizon line is a good thing to have in there. And as far as perspective goes, I usually I mostly wing it based on my knowledge of perspective. I learned perspective, the right ways to do 1, 2, and 3 point perspective back in the day when I was a student, as I think all art students should, in my opinion. Um, but when it comes down to it, I don't try to be overly exacting about the perspective when I'm drawing and sketching, because I think what ends up happening is if I'm too concerned about getting everything exactly on point with the perspective, I will end up losing the momentum of the sketch phase. And obviously this is sped up, but this is still a fairly fast process, and I'm using that, the speed of this sketching method in order to get the ideas out there quickly, because the mind works quickly, and it creates, your mind creates these images quickly, but you don't get them down on paper or virtual paper as fast. So when anything that slows that process down, I think ends up killing the dynamic qualities that the drawing can have at this early stage. And the more dynamic qualities that the drawing has at this stage, the better off the piece will be in the end. Because, in order for me to do a good painting, I have to have a great drawing underneath. And in order to, and so no amount of painting that I could do would ever bring back a drawing that I didn't feel was successful. Because I'm more of a drawer than a painter, this is an important part of the process for me. It's an essential part of creating a great finished piece, a finished color painting. So, you know, my confidence level is much better if I'm happy with the drawing and I feel that the drawing has life and energy to it all throughout the process. So by keeping it loose and focusing on the big shapes first and the major, all the major points of the layout. And then over time, you refine the drawing. If you're happy with the general layout, then you can go in and tighten it up a little bit more. But you try to work on the piece as a whole, not on one area, and then get that all finished and tightly drawn, and then move on to the next one. That's, in my opinion, it's a recipe for disaster, because if you only concentrate on small areas, you may not realize that that small area that you were spending an hour on doesn't work in the context of the greater piece, and so therefore it was just a lot of wasted time. And I feel like you should be able to stop working on an image at any point and get a good sense of, is this going well or is it not? So here you'll see I started to block in some figures in the foreground, again inspired by some of the sketches from my sketchbook. Like I said, it was an open-ended assignment, so they wanted me to include some figures, some characters interacting in some dramatic way. So my first attempt here was to put these kind of bizarre characters in the foreground. There's a guy leaning up against a post on the bridge, on this bridge behind them, or walkway behind them, kind of watching what's going on. One character is a fish wizard, and the other one is this sort of weird lady with her groceries and a pistol in one hand, and for some reason they're not too happy with each other. So again, trying to block it in. They're definitely in the extreme foreground. I thought this would be a good way to kind of draw the viewer in, some sort of dynamic activity in the foreground, some sort of conflict. And the thing about working loosely like this is if things don't work, you can feel okay about changing them early on, or editing or refining it. Sometimes it's good to try to keep things on separate layers too, like foreground elements. Maybe keep those on a separate layer, so you can move them around, scale it up or down, rearrange the individual elements. It's what's kind of great about working digitally, is it's so dynamic in terms of how you can manipulate the imagery very easily. Something that's a little bit more difficult when working analog. I still tend to work with analog pencils, traditional pencils. But in this case, I wanted to just do the whole piece digitally. So as you can see, once I'm kind of okay with certain part of the drawing, I'll tighten it up a little more, maybe make the lines a little darker. In this case, I'm blocking in some value to see how it works. I think my concern here was that perhaps the two figures were occupying equal amounts of space, and therefore just kind of dividing the piece in half, as opposed to sort of being a little more staggered. And as you'll see, later on I try something completely different. But that's what's good about working rough like this early on. I'm happy with the background, the general layout for the background, but obviously the characters in the foreground are going to be hugely important. It's going to be the first thing that people take notice of. So I've got to get it right. So I'm making a rookie mistake here, which is I'm still not completely happy with the characters, but I want to see if I can fall in love with them more by starting to ink them in, by doing sort of final ink lines. And as you'll see later on, it ultimately was a mistake, because I was focusing too much on trying to make something work that just wasn't working. So you'll see by example how focusing in on a particular part of the image before the whole thing is satisfactory to me or to you or to the artist, is can be a mistake. But what's great is, again, working fast, working fairly loose, and working on separate layers and working digitally allows you to correct mistakes and to try new things and to experiment and to iterate very easily. So I'm using a sort of one of my inking brushes here. It's again a flat round brush that just has a fade to it. I like it. I like doing inking this way sometimes because it has that sort of rapidograph feel to it, as opposed to a more brush-like feel. But at this stage, I know something's not really working. The inking isn't helping. It's not making it better. It's not solving the problem, the fundamental problem that I have with these foreground characters, which is I'm just not convinced of their interaction or of their placement in the scene, and frankly of their level of interest. Like, I'm not sure that this interaction is interesting, especially because I haven't really spent some time thinking about what they're doing and why they're doing it. But I will continue, as you'll see, and I will continue to dig myself into this hole for a while, trying to distract myself from admitting the obvious by sort of getting lost in inking and hatching and doing line work. For me, doing line work is very cathartic. I love drawing. I love mark making. So, in a weird way, it's a good way for me to not think. And perhaps ultimately, it was a good thing to do this because it gave me some time to relax my brain, to to not concern myself with the problem at hand, and maybe allow my mind to wander a bit. I'm giving it, I've given myself something to do, but I've allowed my mind to wander a bit by doing this. Sometimes, sort of taking yourself out of the piece and maybe doing a separate drawing on another piece of paper, or if we're working digitally here, I kind of concentrate on playing around with some other ideas. You might hit upon something that will then um, lead you in the direction of a better solution. I do it again. I go back and I try a different inking method. This one with a pen tool that's more like a brush, a thin brush. So I'm getting that sort of tapered line. But as you'll see, it still doesn't fix the problem. So we all do it, right? We all make mistakes. We all dig ourselves in holes at times. But the mark of a good artist is, or one of the marks of a good artist is when you can admit to yourself that you're making a mistake and that you might need to just go back to a previous state and start over. So like I said, I'm quite happy with the rough sketch of the city in the background. It's just these foreground characters that are killing me. I don't remember exactly when I finally admit it. We'll see. I get fairly far into inking these characters before I finally say, all right, let's try something completely different. See, I'm looking at it. I'm erasing. Aha, see? Thinking, well, maybe I need to go back to the sketch. Try bringing that in, wondering if maybe that would help if I change the head to something from the sketch that I liked. Playing around with it. I think it was, maybe it was the first head that I didn't like so much. So then I try this head for the Fish Wizard. I debated whether or not to show this part of my process, but I think it's good when you can see an artist, a fellow artist, sort of struggling and through their process. I mean, sometimes all we see is the final piece. We don't see the journey that it took to get there. Look, now I'm distracting myself even more by trying to ink something else. But then I ultimately come to my senses and I obliterate the foreground elements. And I work a little bit more on refining the middle ground elements while I continue to think about what I could do. And that maybe the answer will come in the background, in the city itself and the structures of the city. Maybe I'll think of an idea as I'm sort of working on the architectural elements of this image. Just let that space sit empty for a while. Allow my brain to kind of fill it mentally with different ideas. These are things that you have to kind of get in the habit of doing and forcing yourself to do, is to find ways to get your brain out of the rut, and get it out of the corner that it's been backed into. So I decide to tighten up the environment, go into defining the architectural elements a little more clearly. I'm not using any reference for this architecture at this point, but I'm drawing from my mental database, and again, it keeps it fairly loose and expressive that way, but you can't just hope that your mental database will expand on its own. I'm always constantly looking at images of architecture and sort of recording things mentally, saving pictures, etc. I don't do as well working directly from reference. I'm better at kind of like separating the process of looking at reference from the process of creating an image. So it's really more about having a good visual memory and building and exercising your visual memory by doing imaginative drawing, or even doing what I call like some memory drawing, where you look at something, you try to memorize it, and then you go and you draw it without looking at it. And I think this is a good exercise to help with things like drawing things that don't exist, stuff that doesn't exist in the real world, imaginative drawing. It gives you the tools to kind of like invent things that are a little more believable, I believe. but again, you have to constantly stock that database. You have to keep, because otherwise you'll end up sort of retreading the same territory over and over again. In the case of this image, I'm definitely thinking of this as existing in the fantasy world that I created called Gateway. So, you know, I want it to have some familiarity in terms of looking like it belongs in the city of Gateway, but occasionally having things that are a little bit different. And the more I add to that visual database, the more I can include those kinds of elements and change things up a little bit here and there, because a city is dynamic. A city has cities are built by lots of different hands and with a lot of different cultural influences. So it's cities rarely are uniform in their architectural forms unless they were built sort of with a plan in mind. But then cities like that generally tend to not be as interesting or dynamic or livable, frankly. So still haven't figured out what I want to do with the foreground, but it's okay. I think eventually I will figure it out. I know something is going to go there. And as I'm doing this, I'm thinking about the stories of Gateway and the world I created. What kind of things happen? Um, what kind of dynamics exist in this world that I created? Um, what's something that you might see on a typical day, or even something that might be a little bit out of the ordinary, but still makes sense in the context of a story that perhaps I'm trying to create. And so I hit upon an idea, which is I want to show a conflict between um, a character that's clearly some sort of authority figure or a city guard or policeman, and a character that is sort of trying to escape, or get away with something. Um, Perhaps they stole something, or something's in their possession that they don't want the authorities to know they have, or to get back from them. Um, so it's more of a chase scene, perhaps, or an escape scene. And I think that would make it more dynamic. The characters aren't going to be as large in the foreground, but my hope is that the action of the characters will draw the viewer in, and the city environment will play a larger role in this image. In the world of Gateway, I have a lot of people, especially the authorities, sort of ride around on these automatons that are created by magic. So I really wanted to include one of those, like sort of one of these sort of walking chariots. Um, Most likely influenced by my love of Star Wars as a child, with those two and four-legged walking robot or walking behemoth robots, the AT-AT walker and the um, is it the AT-ST, the one that they used in Endor in Return of the Jedi. I don't know. I think I've just always loved that idea, that imagery, and so using those influences to help me to design things that I think are interesting and fun for my own fantasy world. So instead of driven by technology or um, uh, you know some sort of technological power source, my walking chariots are powered by magic. But in the story of Gateway, only the authorities are allowed to use powerful magic, whereas the average citizen, they can't be trusted with it. So it's been certain types of magic in the World Gateway have been outlawed for use by ordinary citizens, but in the same way that during Prohibition in the United States, there was a lot of drinking going on. In fact, maybe more so than before Prohibition was enacted. Um, in the World Gateway, despite the laws and the regulations and the strict um, and the inquisition of those who practice illegal magic, a lot of magic is going on, and maybe this character who's trying to escape from the authorities has some sort of item that is important to the resistance movement or to magic itself. Maybe it contains secrets of magic that um, the powers that be wanted buried and forgotten, because you can't have that kind of dangerous magic in the hands of ordinary people who are irresponsible and can't be trusted to make the right decisions and can't be trusted with that amount of power, right? So here we have, I'm thinking of the figure in the foreground. He's got something that he shouldn't have, and he's trying to escape back to the underground with it. But he's in a bad way because he's out in the open. And he's being followed and chased by and shot at by one of these inquisitors or city guard. So I'm starting to feel much better about this piece now. I'm not downplaying the background by having characters in the extreme foreground like I was before. Instead, I'm allowing the environment to help tell the story and be part of the piece. And then you'll see I jump around, different parts of the image. Obviously, the characters still need some to be refined in the foreground, but because I'm happy with their general placement, I can kind of move around with confidence and make sure that other parts of the image are working and continue to get some attention. Going into details, you'll see that I have not really zoomed in very much on the image, and that's again to prevent me from the inclination to sort of get in there and noodle on little details. But if I just force myself to stay in this viewport, I won't be tempted to do that. Once you start zooming in, you start adding a lot of time onto the creation of the piece, because what you'll find is that if you work on the whole piece on the piece as a whole, that certain areas may or may not need to be fully completely fleshed out and rendered in detail, because they may not be visible, or it may end up distracting if you put too much detail into a certain area. So it's really about that balance and making sure that things are done for a good reason. Ellipses are always difficult. They're always, when we're doing environments and architecture, you're inevitably going to have to draw some ellipses. So it's a good thing to learn how to do correctly. A lot of students or people who are learning how to paint and draw make a very common mistake when it comes to ellipses. And it's sort of hard to explain without showing you visual. But what they do is they'll create a curve that essentially just stops when it reaches the edge of the image. Let's say you're drawing a tube, right? So you get the straight lines that create, going the parallel straight lines, the parallel vertical straight lines, and then you create that curve, and then you kind of have it so that it just stops when it hits the edge or one of those parallel lines. And then you create another kind of curved line on top of that, sort of like these. And then what you end up with at both edges is a sharp turn. An ellipse is all about drawing that curved line through, drawing through. And even if you can't see the other side of the circle, right? If we're looking up at the ellipse, you still have to show how that circle continues around the corner, right? Something that takes some practice. Scott Robertson has some really, really great tutorials on drawing ellipses in some of his tutorials. But it's something that just takes practice, takes time, and the more you do it, the easier it becomes. As you can see, I'm starting to get into a lot more detail here, defining a lot of the architectural elements, getting into some pretty specific stuff, showing how these elements are created or constructed. Again, as I was saying, architecture is one of those things that it's a subject matter that, can be very daunting. But the more you observe and really, really look at how buildings are built and how material is used and what types of material are used and how and what the methods for creating the various elements are, the better you get at it. It's like with anything. It's like with anatomy. When you first start drawing a human figure, you're just lost because you think, well, why does the arm do that there, and what's that muscle there, and what does it look like, and why does it always look like, why does it look like this from this angle, but it looks like that from another angle, So it's just all about sort of expanding your knowledge of how things work and how things are pieced together. And it's, if you want to be able to create really cool environments and fantasy scenes, I think it's essential. Even if your main concentration is on characters, those characters are sometimes going to be in an environment. And, it makes for a more well-rounded artist to understand more principles of things that are around you and that potentially could be around your character. Having a portfolio that has a good balance of characters and creatures and environments is, can't be anything but helpful. And, especially if you're applying for a general concept artist type of job, or if you're freelancing and you want to be able to do different types of projects. Doesn't mean you can't have a style or an approach that's uniquely yours. It just means that the subject matter that you can tackle is greater, and I think that gives you more of a leg up on your fellow artists, um, in terms of sort of your marketability as an artist. This method of drawing, where I'm drawing darker lines over lighter, sketchier lines, can be completely recreated with natural media as well, either using a light table, or what I like to do is I will take a rough sketch, scan it in, and print it out very lightly on a big piece of paper. Just in the dark enough so that you can see it, but not so dark that the next time when you scan the cleaner pencil drawing that you've done over it, that you can't eliminate those original sketchier lines. It's generally the method I use. Um, if I'm working on a big piece of illustration board, it's not generally possible to do it that way. So what I'll do is I'll just do a rough, loose sketch first, but try to keep it very light. And and in areas where it might be too dark, I use a kneaded eraser, and I just kind of smush the kneaded eraser down on the areas that are too dark, and it lifts up some of that drawing. It's not erasing it. It's just it's not the same as necessarily as erasing something completely out. But what it does is it just kind of lightens the line work. It takes some of that graphite off so that it's not as dark. And again, I keep going back to a further out zoom, because I want to make sure that it's all working, and that I haven't done something that kind of killed the piece. Studying the way cities are built, um, really quite fascinating, especially old cities, because they tend to have lots and lots of layers. And the older and bigger a building is, the more likely it has had different states at different times, and has had things added or things taken off, depending on the type of building it is. Castles are really fascinating because they really can evolve greatly over time, and have different sections that were built at different times. And I really love that idea. And I think cities are the same way. They certain neighborhoods have a particular feel to them, and it might be because of when a majority of the structures in that neighborhood were built, and how well they were preserved over time. Neighborhoods that feel inauthentic are the ones where I think where things are kind of built more recently, and only for the idea of convenience, and where they're trying to create an environment artificially. I mean, I think it's a fascinating subject, and there are a lot of these sort of planned towns and communities that are meant to sort of have a feel of a real organic place, but it usually falls flat because there's just something about a city that has grown over time, or a place that grows and evolves over time, that you just can't recreate artificially, because time sort of does funny things. And you know different types of materials, building materials, or standards for um, construction quality, change the look of things over time. And so I always try to show that sort of idea in my environments, or in my city environments for specifically. At some point, I probably should get back to working on the figures in the foreground. I'm definitely happier with this image at this point, but I'm having a little fun here, tightening up the architectural elements. Buildings tell a story of their history, what their purpose was. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's hard to figure out, but it's there. It may not be an interesting story. Sometimes it might be a really interesting story. So you have to balance those things, right? I always love the idea of seeing things that are very elaborate, but ultimately are a simple thing, like a staircase that goes maybe from a plaza up to street level, but that has elaborate carvings and filigree, or maybe a statue or a figure carved into the side of it, or you know stones that are very finely cut, and then you might look at another place in the city and see a staircase that's just made out of wood or made from metal, like simple metal staircase, just as a way to get people from down to up, or from up to down, So it always makes you wonder why all the effort on this one staircase but not on this other one, right? What was the reasoning behind it? That stuff I think is really interesting when it comes to the cities. You see that kind of dynamic. Obviously, money is often a factor. Time, resources. So I'm going to start going in and tightening up the figures in the foreground. So just continuing here to tighten up the drawing of this character on his walking chariot. I like doing this kind of creating these sort of machines that are a mixture of something that looks like technology and something that looks more like more organic, something in between, almost like something made out of bone or wood, or with some sort of with other organic material, but powered by magic, but yet still constructed, something that was built, not necessarily that was grown. But No, what I try to do is strike a good balance, because you don't want something to look too sci-fi if that's not what you're going for, right? I mean, you have to, everything in your world, when you're designing it should, while you can have great variety, especially in a setting like a city, you still need to make sure that things feel as if they're from the same world. You don't want to have things that just don't belong, just because it looks cool. You need to make sure it all gels with the vision of the world that you're creating. In some cases, the best way to do that is to try to think about the rhythm of the design. The rhythm of something that's built from metal and is more technological and based on technology, uh, modern technology or futuristic technology. It has a different rhythm, I think, than something that is built maybe with wood and stone and bone. Uh, and a good way to sort of get that is to kind of look at other things that are, as inspiration. Look up pictures of things. Here I'm trying to find pictures of these sort of old school flintlock pistols. But even looking in those, you might find ideas for how to create other pieces of technology, other things in your world, especially if it's not something that really exists. I mean, there were no, you know, walking chariots made of bone and wood at any time period. But you can try to find things from different time periods that maybe were made with the same types of materials, and that will help you to kind of come up with some ideas to how to solve those visual problems. I use reference fairly sparingly. I use it, as inspiration. Like I was saying before, I kind of look at it and then I go and I do my own interpretation to avoid getting overly attached to the reference. As I was saying before, about the staircases, I love the idea of simple things with complex solutions. A staircase or a railing, but yet in this case, it's the railing is a carved, you know, dragon head and body, um, as opposed to just a plain old railing. So now I'm going to start working on this character, the central figure, or the central character in the image, other than the guy in the chariot. But I think this guy is the person you're most interested in finding out what his story is, his or her. What I do is I sort of play around and stay loose, trying to focus mainly on silhouette in the beginning and interesting shapes. I love masks. I love characters wearing masks. Not because I'm afraid to draw faces, which I'm not, but just because, I don't know, there's something about a character wearing a mask. I almost feel as if it allows the viewer to really put themselves in the place of the character in the scene. Um, and also, to some degree, I know this runs counter to what most uh, people would say, especially from a marketing sense. But I actually I like images that don't necessarily look back at you. They don't stare back at you. depending on the case. You know, to me, I when I look at art, I kind of like being an outside observer. You know, looking at this strange world and wondering what it's about and what's going on, as opposed to a character trying to draw me into the story or whatever is going on. Sometimes I avoid that kind of confrontation just because there's something I like about being the sort of an outside observer. So masks sort of do that. They remove a bit of that connection between the viewer and the character in the image. And like I said, it sounds like the opposite of what you should do if you want to create a compelling image. But I like playing with that notion. I like challenging that notion. Now that might sound like you know, like I'm giving way too much meaning to why I you know wear put characters with masks, but it really I was I guess I didn't realize until I had to think about it for a while and figure out why it is I was compelled to do that. I think initially I just did it because I liked masks and I like characters wearing masks. Um, but now I have a very convincing sounding reason for why I do it. I'm rebelling against the idea. I also like rebelling against that idea that you know you have to have like if you're doing like a fight scene between two characters, and of course in this case, I'm not rebelling. I'm actually adhering to the standard or to the popular notion. But you know, oftentimes you see book covers with a main character fighting a creature, and you know the hard thing to solve there is always, well, how do you make it so that how do you make the bad guy and the good guy both so that they're looking toward the viewer as opposed to away from the viewer, which might you know alienate the viewer. Um, but I actually like. I have several images, and some of which are in my the book that I've been working on, Gateway, where the main character is facing away from the viewer. Um, and again, I think in some ways that you know is it may be counterintuitive, but I sort of like the idea that you know we can sort of look at the character and think, well, maybe we're looking at what that character is looking at, and we want to see what he or she is seeing. And the only way that can happen is if we have a similar eye line or eyesight, sight line rather, as the character. Because if a character is looking towards you, you don't know what they're seeing. Um, so there's something about that I kind of like, and I feel like maybe in a way it's interactive. It makes you feel like you are the character as opposed to you're you know you're meeting the character. So this character has a crab claw on one of his arms. That's just because it's cool. I like crab claws, and I hadn't put one on a character in a while, so thought this would be a good time. Plus, it makes you wonder why exactly he has a crab claw. Is it a spell? Is this a permanent attachment? This character is, you know, perhaps hiding his or her identity, but is nonetheless flamboyant. Look at that hat. You're not really going to blend into the crowd with a hat like that. The whole time I'm working on this, I still want to try to remain conscious of how what the viewer's journey through the image is going to be. So I try to make sure that at all times that I'm drawing the viewer uh, into the image and you know having them go on a journey through the image. You don't want the viewer to reach a dead end and kind of you know have nowhere else to go. So again, that's about rhythm. It's about balancing the elements. I think initially I saw that whole back area as like a big plaza, but now I like the idea that it's water, so I'm going to add some boats in there. And still just tightening everything. Do it. It happens in stages. He's got a little pterodactyl friend. Flies around with him. Sometimes perches on his hat. Who wouldn't want a little pterosaur pet? I know I would. Maybe if I had a pterosaur as a pet when I was a kid, I wouldn't have gotten beat up so much in high school or junior high. I didn't get beat up in high school, just junior high. But if I had my little pet pterosaur, well, that would have stopped him. So just adding a lot of architectural details. Again, most of this I'm doing sort of intuitively from memory, or just based on kind of stuff that I've looked at and put into my visual library, my mental visual library. Had a little action here, show where the gunshot just whizzed past his head and took out this statue's eye. The brush I'm using here is kind of like it's a tapered sort of ink pen. I've liked inking digitally, doing a lot of that lately, but at the same time, I'm also I'm going to be recommitting myself to traditional inking and going back to that sort of my roots, I guess you could say, because I do miss it. But I think I had given it up sort of because I was frustrated by Crow Quill pens. I typically use a Hunt 102, and they're notorious for sort of breaking and blobbing the ink. So I kind of switched to microns for a while, and then I kind of went to digital inking for a while. But I recently discovered, thanks to the help of my good buddy Tony Palumbo, a new nib pen called the Nico G Pen, which you have to order online. You can't really get it in stores around here. And it's real smooth, doesn't break or fray or blob very easily. It's a pretty solid inking pen. So I'm gonna get back into that, especially since I just picked up my copy of Ian Miller's uh, collected illustration and artwork, and it's just it's so stunning, and it reminds me of all the reasons I got into art and all the reasons that I wanted to be an illustrator. And that man is he's the master of pen and ink. So I've always loved line work. Sometimes I do more lines than other times, depending on my mood and what the assignment is and how much time I have. This part, I don't know about you. To me, this is actually a fun part of the drawing stage. I like the very first part, um, where sort of the preliminary drawing. I don't like as much the part where I'm kind of like tightening and refining the rough drawing. But then I like it again when I get to the part where I'm doing kind of the finer ink work. And then I like the next stage where I'm sort of blocking in base colors, all nailing down the color scheme. That's fun. And then again, it's not as fun towards the end when I'm having to reconcile all the tiny painting details going in, and that's where I start to get impatient. At the final stage of painting all the details. I don't know what it is. It just I mean, it's satisfying when you get the good result at the end, but to me, it's a bit of a trudge getting there. It's generally why I do a lot of my detailing in this stage, in sort of the pen and ink stage, or the inking stage rather, because it's more fun for me to do it here than it is with paint, with color. And that's a personality thing. Like I said, I like making marks, mark maker at heart. So let's check my perspective there and make sure the lines make sense based on the other lines in the image. And that's what I mean about sort of, I don't plot out my perspective. I just make sure I check it against other things that are in the image as I go along. That's why, zooming in and out and sometimes flipping your canvas, all these things help. Cropping it a little tighter, but keeping the characters, fairly large and prominent, bringing them up a little bit more. I felt like they were too small in the scene, so I reduced the background a bit, cropped it out, and then so that way making sure the characters don't get lost too much in the background. That was what I was doing there. All right, more tightening of line work of the. So now begins the process, and this is also a fairly lengthy process of tightening up all the stuff in the background. Making sure there aren't any details that I'm missing, putting in details where they will help and add interest. Adding the boats and stuff to show that there is some life in this city. But part of the story behind Gateway is that, it's kind of nuts. I mean, you have this amazing city. It's it's been built over, a couple thousand years. Um, but but yet it's in a time where things aren't so great, and people are afraid to be out in the streets too much, because they're not really free to live their lives as they choose. So they choose to go underground or stay inside, and so therefore, at times the streets can seem kind of empty, or at least not sort of that creepy, uh, amount of population around. It's like seems like there should be a lot more people, but for some reason there aren't. It's like walking around downtown Toronto on the weekend when there's when it's a non-business day. At least last time I went to Toronto, I was there on a Sunday, and man, the downtown was just it was so quiet, and it just seemed odd because I lived in New York City, and the places where people live and work are sort of integrated. Um, but at least the area that I was in Toronto, like the business district, there were other parts that were lively, of course, but the business district just seemed completely dead, and it was just sort of slightly creepy. Not trying. Toronto's a beautiful, lovely city. It's not a creepy city. I'm just saying that particular time I was there was kind of a little eerily quiet. Okay, now I finally get around to laying in some color. So I'm reducing the size of the image, so that I can sort of work on a rough color study. So I can use, that way, I can use bigger brushes, or I can use big brushes and not worry about it sort of chugging my memory. So I can really work fast to kind of work out a color scheme, a palette that I like. I want that water to feature really prominently as a light source. The water in Gateway is is a source of magical energy, or at least it seems like it is, and it seems like it flows with magical energy, that flows down from these mountains to the north. And I want it to be sort of an afternoon, late afternoon kind of sky. Um, Again, sort of playing a bit with that notion of you know, keeping the warmer colors in the foreground and the cooler colors in the background. In this case, the sky is warm, very warm. So you have to make sure that you do other things to make sure that the foreground stays in the foreground, and doesn't get overwhelmed by the warmth of the sky. So I was happy with the palette pretty much right away. I roughed it in, and I took that layer and brought it back over to the larger drawing, and now I can start refining it. So all of this is done in a layer underneath the drawing. Um, that way I can sort of block in all the base colors, um, and I'm not worrying about detailing things in right now. I'm just trying to take that initial palette that I developed and block in lighting and color, in the most basic of ways. So I'm using a nice big brush, that flat brush again, I think, and thinking about my lighting source. It's coming from the right, so the buildings on the left are going to be lit, um, whereas the buildings on the right are going to be in shadow. again, blocking in the roof colors. I don't want it to all be the same red. Maybe it's different types of clay. But it's all in the red range, reddish orangish range. Vermilion. Again, all of this is being done on the layer behind the drawing right now. And this is fun. I like this stage because it really just starts to come together, and I try not to agonize too much. If I'm not getting the reason I do it this way, this quickly, is because if the color scheme isn't working, I can easily go back and try again. I can just nuke it and try something different. Just so happened that I kind of liked where this was going, so I didn't have to nuke it. And again, same thing. Blocked it in real rough. Now I'm going back in, tightening it a little bit more. And then after I'm happy with that, I'll tighten it up a little bit more. And then eventually I'll start painting details and highlights on a layer over the drawing to sort of paint out some of the line work. But in the end, there'll still be a lot of line work left in the image. Again, notice, still on the layer underneath the drawing. Getting all of the important decisions made at this stage and not leaving any major decisions for later when it could potentially, make or break the image. I want to get all the hard problems solved first. Thinking about secondary sources of lighting. Again, take note of how I'm sort of working across the entire image, not just focusing on one area. Still zoomed out, right? It's part of that sort of artistic discipline that sometimes takes a while to learn. Took me a while. I was very obstinate. I was very stubborn about it. I really just wanted to focus on detailing, the cool parts, and didn't want to think as much about the less, at least at the time, the less interesting stuff. Eventually, I learned the hard way. I'm not really sure what that means. My art professors beat me up. That's how. So now I do it out of fear. The one thing I still am not disciplined enough to do on a regular basis is flip my canvas and check my work that way. I know this is a sign of weakness, and it's embarrassing to admit it, but I don't flip my canvas very often, and I should, but it scares me. I actually do. I have noticed that my drawings do tend to have a lean to them, a tilt. Maybe everyone does, except a robot. If you wanted a robot to seem more human, you would program him to have a tilt in his drawings. It's a little pro tip there. So because I have a very warm background, sometimes you have to do things like, pick a color that you want to over accentuate on something that's in the foreground and never have it anywhere else in the image quite of that saturation. There's plenty of red in this image, like in the roofs and stuff, but none of the reds none of the reds is quite as saturated as that of the mask on this character. So that draws the viewer's eye pretty immediately. Still working on that background layer, or the layer underneath the drawing. Plotting out the highlights. Even working on some details. And you notice again, even when I do details, some details, I'm still not zooming in because if you want a detail to be readable, you do it so that you can, you do it at a zoomed out level so that you can check to make sure it's looking readable. To me, you work to make sure things look good, from a distance, and then you can go in, and once you've locked in, the sort of the base look or design of something, then you can go in and just accentuate it and fill in the cool details. Because doing it the other way could mean a lot of working and reworking and reworking, and I don't have the patience for that. I demand immediate gratification. I have a short attention span. But the reason I know that mark making and line work is the thing for me is because it's the one thing I can do and just do for hours and hours and not get bored. It has sort of an obsessive quality to it. Mark making does that that appeals to me and makes it enjoyable. And after all, that's what we should be doing, is enjoying our art. So now you see I'm finally working on layers on top and adding some atmospheric perspective on the layer on top of the drawing. Just roughing it in first, and then you can go back and erase out in the areas where it overlaps stuff that you don't want to have the atmospheric perspective of the carriages in the foreground, etc. I over-exaggerate in this layer, but because it's a separate layer, then I can just play with the opacity of the layer and drop it back however much I want. You know, sometimes even if something's a cool detail, you have to know the right time to bring it out and the right time to drop it back and make it, you know, something that supports the composition of your piece, the balance of your piece. You know, you shouldn't sacrifice the entire image just for one cool detail that you want people to see really badly. It's not worth it. It's not worth ruining the whole piece. Somebody will see it, don't worry. But in fact, because it's in shadow, the person that finds that cool detail will be especially proud of themselves, and they'll tell all their friends. They'll say, look at this cool detail. You missed it, I didn't. All kidding aside, you do want people to talk about your image. You do want them to share it with their friends. And so that's one way of doing it. So putting stuff in there to keep coming back to and new things to see every time you look at the image again. Sometimes people only have a few seconds to look at something. But if if it's compelling enough, they'll either they'll save it in some way so they can come back and look at it again later, or they'll be compelled to spend some extra time with it, with the image. For me personally, every time I go to an art museum, I always stop and stare at the pieces that have a lot to look at, and spend the most time with those. Especially like Albert Bierstadt paintings of the American West, or the Hudson River School of Painters, their environment paintings and stuff. I could just stare for hours, especially Bierstadt's painting and some of his other contemporaries. His landscapes, they're crazy. There's so much going on in them. There's so much to see. I just love the effect it has. You can stand really close. Next time you get to see a big Albert Bierstadt painting in a museum somewhere, if you are so lucky, get up as close as you can to it and just let it take up your whole vision, your whole periphery, and it's an amazing experience. You'll feel transported. I promise you. I guarantee it. If not, you can write me a sternly worded email saying, nope, still felt like I was in New Jersey or wherever it is that you find this Albert Bierstadt painting. I could be wrong. I don't think there's any in New Jersey, but definitely Washington, D.C., probably New York, and probably other places. So there you have it. Oh, wait, no, we're not done yet. I forgot. There's a lot more to go. Never mind that. We've got lots more details to put in here. So now at this stage, I'm doing a lot of painting over top of the drawing layer. And this is when I'm painting out some of that line work and refining it more like a painting. And again, like I said, for me, I can't really do a good painting unless I have a good drawing underneath of it. And so in some ways, you're painting out work that was done, but in a lot of ways that was, it was plotting out. Those lines were helping to plot out the image and parts of the image, and they were very necessary in order to arrive at the final solution. I end up doing a good deal of painting in this image because the drawing in the background is still fairly rough. It's not a really tight drawing, and this is just one way of approaching this. I'm trying to approach this image in thinking of it as a complex image, but something that I have a limited amount of time for. I don't have the luxury of 2 weeks or whatever, or a week. I've got a couple days. So yeah, I think this image probably came in around 16 hours total, I would say. Once I'm done. I'm not done yet, but it was pre-recorded, so I'm not working this fast. It was sped up 8 times. I think 8 times faster than I created it in. So yes, I think it's about a 2-hour video. We're approaching an hour and a half, and but it was about 2 hours, so that means that in total it was around 16 hours to create the final image. I'd say that's that's probably a typical amount of time you would have to create an image like this for, let's say, a video game or a concept piece. Maybe you'd have a lot more time for like if this was a marketing image, something that's meant to promote, a game or a movie or whatever. But let's just say that this is a sort of a look and feel piece for a concept piece for a game or a movie. When you're adding lighting into your windows, lights in your windows, don't make them all the same color. People have different light sources. I mean, in Gateway, some of it's magic, right? But also, the things that people hang in their windows can often affect the color of the light coming out, or the color of the glass itself could be tinted in some way for some reason. And really, at this point, this is the stage that I said sometimes be a little frustrating and tedious, which is sort of going in and just finishing all the details, and carving out all the areas that need a little more spit and polish. roof tiles. Don't just put a flat color on there and say people will figure out what the roof's made out of. If you have a detailed piece, that's why it really pays to try to be knowledgeable about a lot of different things. What did people make the roof tiles out of? Clay, slate, wood, ceramic. So, next stage, and right now it's hard to see, but I think I'm just refining a lot of really small details. But again, at this zoomed out phase here. All right, now I'm going to start going in and adding some texture. Using different brushes, texture brushes, to kind of add a layer of texture and grit to the scene. And also that'll help to sort of push back some of that line work even a little bit more. And also continuing to lay in some details and lighting and stuff. This is really the settle in and get comfy stage. You're going to be with this image for a while, so just settle into kind of like a rhythm and just keep moving towards that goalpost. A little atypical, non-typical sports analogy there for me. That's why I got beat up a lot in junior high, because I wasn't in sports. Not only is this video recording about the process of painting this piece, but it's also about me getting beat up. Actually, I'm really lying. I don't know that I really got beat up that much at all. I just want you all to feel bad for me. I want sympathy. It's really what it is. Getting a little wacky. It's not easy talking for 2 hours. 2 hours straight. With no breaks. I didn't stop this at all and recorded in chunks. Wink, wink. Of course, what am I saying? I've taught 6-hour college course studios. I wasn't talking the whole 6 hours, but there were times you can ask some of my former students. I seem to have no problem talking for 2 or 3 hours. It's another reason I got beat up a lot in junior high. I talked too much. See how I brought that around? It's very clever of me. So, when you have something that's in highlight, that's in shadow, as much as this sort of statue dragon head thing is, if you want to add details and highlights, make sure that even if it's highlight, it's not that much lighter. You're not making a really bright highlight. You're making it just slightly lighter than the base color, the base tone. It still reads as a highlight, but it doesn't. But then it also therefore is sort of appropriate for the amount of lighting it gets. So it's getting highlights that are based on sort of a secondary light source or bounced light, and so it's not going to be as bright. Plus, the material could be darker, so therefore the highlights won't be as bright unless it's a shiny surface, in which case you get specular highlights, and yada yada, right? But again, there are ways to have things that are supposed to be in shadow, but yet have a specularity to it. There's ways to do that and still, make sure it doesn't compete with other things. You really want to try to craft and be very conscious of the brightest areas of your image, and make sure that those are deliberate, and that the bright areas, the highlights, the most saturated areas that they're in the places exactly where you want them to be, and that they're meant to draw the viewer's eye to important things as opposed to unimportant things. It's okay for secondary details to get lost in the shadows. That's why they're secondary. Again, I apologize. It's really hard to see what I'm doing here, but I'm definitely sort of tightening, and I'm doing exactly that. I'm making sure that I'm putting highlights in certain areas, but I'm making sure that they don't compete with other parts of the image. And right now, actually, it's a little bit muddled, and there's some areas that perhaps are too bright, and at some point, I think I drop them back. I hope I do that. That'll make me look smart. And really, that's the main goal in my life, is to make sure that I look smart at all times, or that I seem smart, because I don't want to get beat up anymore. Of course, being smart was what got me beat up when I was in junior high. Even though I didn't get beat up, really. But there's going to be a lot of YouTube comments about this, I think. Or maybe not. That's the new way of being beat up, right? It's like, nasty YouTube comments on your YouTube video of your family cat. And people beat you up verbally. That's why I don't post any videos of my cat on YouTube. I figure the internet's got enough cat videos. So again, even though you notice I'm sticking pretty closely to my initial palette, but that doesn't mean that the image can't have dynamic colors in it, and that you can't have areas that stray a bit from the palette. But as long as you're doing it thoughtfully. I mean, like for instance, look in the shadow of that carved railing, on the staircase in the foreground there. I've added you can see sort of this hint of blue. It's a cool shadow. But yet it's not so blue that it interferes with the blue of the water, or that it moves the palette in a completely different direction when you squint your eyes. That's the thing. If you squint your eyes and something is distracting from the palette that you established, then that's when you have to kind of address that and figure out ways to push those colors back a bit, or downplay them, or or eliminate them. Because that's why you do the palette, in a smaller view and a zoomed out view to begin with. Because if it works zoomed out, it'll work. When you do all the details as well, and once everything's tightened up, it'll work then too. So if it's working, don't mess it up. It's possible if I zoomed in too much, I might spend an hour, detailing the guy in the boat back there and showing his fingers and the buttons on his vest and what color socks he was wearing, and then you zoom out and you can't even see it, so it didn't really matter, and you just spend a bunch of time on something that was completely worthless. If this was an image that was meant to be seen, like, and it's 12 feet high, and then then it would make sense. But this is meant to be reproduced in a magazine page, and there's plenty of details and things for people to look at it, at that size. Again, it's really just part of that balance. You want to work hard. You want to impress the viewer, but you don't want to work hard on stuff that can't be seen or won't be noticed or might end up killing the piece anyways. So, like Scrooge McDuck used to say, work smarter, not harder. But I kind of modify that, and I say work smarter and harder. But mostly smarter. But in all seriousness, find your obsession, right? Find your passion. Because that will, if you're passionate about something, you will gladly put the time into it. You will gladly work hard, right? That's the whole point. That's the key to this art thing. Is finding something that you're passionate about, and a way of working that is intuitive and that is unique to you, because that's what's going to make your work stand out from the crowd, make it noticeable and recognizable and memorable, right? It took me a while, and I had to kind of eventually realize I had to disabuse myself of this notion that I had to look like some other artist, in order to get work, or for my work to be noticed. It's actually exactly the opposite, right? The more you look like other artists, or the more you mimic what other artists do, the more you're going to be lumped in with, not necessarily with that artist, but with other artists that are doing the same thing and trying to mimic the same artist that you are. So I'm dropping in this texture layer. It's a paper texture that I made a long time ago. I use a lot. It just adds sort of a level of noise to the image. You can play around with the layer effect, and again with a bit with the opacity as well. And then the next stage here is I want to create some signs. One of the things that I think is really cool and neat about cities that I don't see enough of in illustrations or concept art of city scenes is signage. Cities have signs. There are businesses and restaurants and stores and municipal offices and just all kinds of things that allow you to know where you are and where you're going, and help you to navigate, or find things, or identify your place in the city. So, put some signs in there. So I'm kind of creating on a separate layer, creating these shapes, making sure they're in the right perspective. I'm not worrying about what's on the sign yet. I'm just trying to fit them in to the composition in an interesting way. And then I can sort of go in and and again, I haven't decided on colors for these signs yet. I'm drawing again. I'm going in and I'm drawing the details on a sort of neutral color first. So in a small way, I'm doing the same method as I did for the whole piece, but just for these individual small pieces. Now I'm going in and overlaying color into them, onto them. Making sure that the colors are balanced too. And I'm going in and adding some typography, figuring out what these different. I like this part. This is fun for me, like coming up with wacky or interesting signage and names of these crazy businesses. The boot and buckle or the bow tie hut, right? Gateway has a bit of that sort of humor to it. It's sort of this bizarre world that can often be sort of a little bit exaggerated and comedic, but in sort of a quirky way. Gateway and the world of Gateway is very quirky. Again, if I had more time, I might design these a little more heavily, like using some established fonts, or maybe developing my own fonts for some of the signs. I'm not the world's best graphic designer, so in some ways I kind of have to um, play around with the ideas a little more than maybe someone who's a natural designer or graphic designer. I mean, what we do when we create images, and we're designing all the time. We're designing elements and we're designing a scene. But I guess specifically what I mean is graphic design. It's not one of my fortes or forts. I'm okay at it, but there are people who are much better. So I'm still finding things in the background that I want to tighten up. Tightening up these, you can't have the signs. Well, you could have the signs just floating if the world is very magical, which Gateway is, but in this case, having your sign be floating would be expensive, would be a frivolous use of magic, which is taboo now in the city of Gateway. So you got to watch it with that. All right, so this stage is really about just kind of going around and checking everything, and then signing it when I'm fairly happy with it. So there you go. Is the finished image. Hope you guys enjoyed it.